The future of conservation is in our hands. Communities everywhere are making the natural world stronger and healthier to rebalance the planet. That must be the key to combating climate change that can save us all.
We have some rare but important good news about climate.
I'm optimistic that when my children are my age, things will be different.
PCSSM here at the University of Pennsylvania, where I also teach in the School of Arts and Sciences and the Andrew School for Communication. I want to thank you all for coming out for today's event. I'm truly delighted to welcome PBS and our own PBS affiliate, WHYY, to Penn for what is going to be a conversation with PBS and PCSSM about solutions-driven climate storytelling. As we continue to witness devastating climate disasters that now play out on a seemingly daily basis, the mission to communicate the science and its implications to the public and policymakers has become ever more essential. That is our mission here at PCSSM. Effective communication means connecting not just with people's heads, but their hearts. And compelling narratives and storytelling are essential in that effort. I can think of no organization that does a better job of that than PBS, and so I am particularly excited about our collaborative venture with them here today. Our first panel will consist of exciting upcoming programming from PBS, and our second panel will provide a look at what we're doing at Penn and what WHYY is doing locally in the Philadelphia area. And I now turn it over to our moderator this evening, Bill Gardner, Vice President, Multiplatform Programming and Head of Development at PBS. Thank you, and enjoy the evening.
Hi everybody, and thank you very much for coming out tonight. Thank you especially to Dr. Mann for that introduction and to the University of Pennsylvania Center for Science, Sustainability, and Community. Hosting us here on campus tonight, and those kind words you said about PBS. We do see ourselves as the public broadcaster in this is one of the institutions of the country as well. We're really thrilled to be here tonight to elevate the importance of solutions in climate storytelling. We don't believe in decades. And I just want to take a quick moment as well to introduce some panelists who are going to be having this demonstration. We just heard from our first panelist, Dr. Michael Mann, who is Presidential Distinguished Professor of Earth and Environmental Science and Director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and Community. Dr. Mann was the 2019 recipient of the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement and elected to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 2020. He's written several books communicating climate science to the public, including his forthcoming book, Our Fragile Moment, which comes out in 2 weeks. In addition to Dr. Mann, we'll be joined on stage by Dr. Shane Campbell-Staton. Shane is an evolutionary biologist, an assistant professor in the ecology and evolutionary biology department at Penn Center. He's also the host of our series, Human Footprint, and he's the narrator of our series, Evolution Earth, another episode of which is on tomorrow night. We also have Faye Yu. Faye is an award-winning veteran television executive whose work has spanned a wide variety of genres and styles across some of the biggest brands in the industry. She's developed, produced, and written hundreds of hours of programs, so we're really pleased to have her with us today. She's the head of Current for Part 2 Pictures, where she oversees production across the company and serves as executive producer on numerous projects, including our own America Outdoors with Parenting in Person, which is made by Twin Cities Public Television, and is also on tomorrow night, the second episode of Arkansas. So really, really, really Finally, my colleague Maribel Lopez, who's the head of PBS Digital Studios. As head of PBS Digital Studios, Maribel serves as the executive producer of PBS's original digital program. Prior to joining PBS, Maribel held several creative and leadership roles at member stations Twin City PBS, including the executive producer of the fantastic Sound Film, an award-winning music education YouTube series produced by PBS Digital Studios. We've got about 3 minutes of video to show you to give you a taste of the work that everybody's doing, and after that, we'll dive right into our conversation.
On a planet teeming with life, one species is reshaping the world and determining the future of every other. From what we eat, to how we move, to where we live. So what will be the legacy that defines our species' history? Evolution Earth, heat. As temperatures rise, animals are responding. Doing things never filmed before. Out there, things aren't what you expect. You'll see.
My name is Barrington Day Thurston. I'm a writer, sometimes comedian, and I love being outside. How does the outdoors define us? Is adventure racing the thing where you make life much harder than it needs to be? Always. As individuals, and as a nation.
Are you prepared for the next disaster?
The flash flood right there! Keep going, baby, keep going.
It can kill you. Heat kills.
1 year, we had nothing planted on this farm at all.
Are you ready to help your family and neighbors? Welcome to Weather. In this show, we'll explore the most pressing natural disasters in the U.S., how they're changing, and how you can prepare.
This is literally a lifesaver. Like, this saves people's lives.
I think the lesson to learn is that you have to live within your environment.
If we actually learn how to manage land using fire, we get back into doing restorative and regenerative practices.
We need to be ready for some really big changes coming at us.
Dr. Mann, I'd like to start with you as our host. Solutions-driven climate storytelling. What is that? Why is it important?
Well, it's important because, you alluded to this earlier, doom and gloom, if that's all we get, that's all we see, if that's all we encounter, it potentially leads us down this path of despair and disengagement. And what we need is engagement. We need people to be on the front lines, not the sidelines. And so, as I like to say, we really need to communicate both the urgency and the agency. Urgency without agency leads us nowhere. So yes, we have a crisis on our hands, and if we don't take action now, we will leave behind a fundamentally degraded planet for our children and grandchildren. But that doesn't have to be our future. We still have agency. We still have an opportunity to make sure that that's not a legacy. And so I think it's incumbent upon those of us who are trying to communicate the threat of climate change to make sure that we provide people a path forward. We provide them a sense of what solutions they can involve themselves in.
Thank you. And one of the big things that strikes me in what you just said is about agency is also about communicating and giving people a sense of empowerment. Well, Shane, for you, you're a fantastic television host. We picked you up. You're also a scientist, and you're also a teacher. What role does storytelling and agency and possibility play in your two worlds, and how do they interact?
So, I think that in terms of thinking about storytelling and agency, both in terms of the general public and in the classroom, the two feed each other, I think, pretty fundamentally. I think regardless of, whether you're trying to communicate to, a global audience, or if you're trying to communicate to a classroom, essentially you're trying to communicate with a group of individuals that come from different places. They have different perspectives, different political backgrounds, et cetera, and so much, gets divided along, obscure cultural lines. But the thing that everyone loves, universally, is a story. And, everyone loves a good story. And I think that in order to really communicate anything, especially, what's going on right now with the climate crisis, that you have to be able to tell a good story. And I've seen, both, in my role as a host, being a practicing scientist, has given me insights into specific conversations that have allowed the people that I am interviewing, to sort of give parts of themselves that maybe they wouldn't give otherwise. And, in the same way as a biologist and a professor in the classroom, using this sort of material in the classroom, it gives students something tangible with regard to stories that they can really latch on to. I think it's easy to dismiss an idea. It's a lot harder to dismiss a person. And I think, telling people's stories is a really key part of that process.
Thank you very much. Faye, I'm going to ask you to expand on that. You're a professional storyteller, and you work in lots of genres, lots of styles, and stories before it. And with our series, America Outdoors, which is really supposed to know what you're really trying to do with it, but to Shane's point, stories, and you really made a point of talking to people from across all spectrums. It's not just who teaches and nerdy.
Yes, absolutely. I really 100% agree with what Shane was talking about with telling these human, personal stories. So, America Outdoors is not a show that's explicitly about climate change. It's not about the environment. It's not about anything particularly except our connection to the outdoors in whatever way any particular person has that connection, whether it's a passion or their livelihood or anything that the average person has. If somebody's watching the show, they probably have their own particular interest or passion for the outdoors. So it is very much on a human level and a personal level. And we had this experience of people sharing incredibly personal stories that almost surprised us at times how deeply it would go. But it is always, you can't have a show about people's experience in the outdoors without having, facing this problem every single episode, multiple stories. It's just inevitable because they're all feeling it. And I think that to hear those stories from people on a very experiential level, they feel the change because it's their lives and they experience it firsthand every day. It reflects back on the audience what they've probably experienced in their own ways as well. it's as relatable as it gets, because these are just people telling honest stories with no agenda, right? And I think that's the absolute key. You know, they don't turn on this show expecting a science lesson. We don't really give them a science lesson ever. We just give them, this is the reality, and this is what people are actively doing to address that.
Thanks very much. And in your research, Dr. Mann, you must see the efficacy of this storytelling approach to science, sustainability, and media at this intersection. Is it worth it to break down barriers, to break through?
Yeah, and it was funny. I was just thinking in terms of giving a science lesson. I think there are a number of my students here in the audience, and they've heard enough facts and figures and seen enough graphs, and it's important to provide a scientific understanding for those who wish to get into the details. But for the person on the street, we have to tell them what it means. We have to tell them why it is that they should care about climate change. We have enough other things to worry about in our lives today. There's so many challenges in modern life. And when you tell somebody, well, here's an existential threat that you also need to deal with, and you don't provide them a way forward, something that they can actually do, you really leave them with nowhere to go. And so, it's, I think it's important to communicate both what we can do as individuals, and there are actions that we can all take to minimize our carbon footprint, to decrease our environmental impact, and we should all do those things. But the most important thing we can do as individuals is to use our voice and to use our vote, because there are changes that have to take place. There are policies that we need to incentivize this massive shift that we need away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. We've got to reduce global carbon emissions by 50% within the next decade, get them down to zero by the middle of the century. It's a massive undertaking, but it's possible. The obstacles aren't physical, they're not technological. We have the technology to do this. The obstacles today are political, and so I want people to think about that. We have an immensely important upcoming election, which will determine the path we take, whether we take the actions necessary to avert the climate disaster, or whether we just kick it down the road for further generations to deal with. The choice is ours, and the choice will depend on what we do, how we use our voice, how we use our vote. So think about climate in this next election. Think about your children and grandchildren and what sort of world you want to leave behind for them, or if you're a young person, what sort of world you want to inherit, because this next election will ultimately determine the path that we take on this defining issue of our time.
Thank you. Very well said. Maribel, I'm not going to let you off the hook. I think it's interesting to hear from you now, because of what PBS Digital Studios is, who it targets. And for PBS, as the public broadcaster in our country, we try to reach all audiences. One of the main focuses that Maribel does is younger audiences who are maybe on platforms that aren't maybe in television, but YouTube or communities can build. Can you talk a little bit about what you see about behaviors and how you're addressing this issue?
Absolutely. So thanks. A lot of the work that I lead at PBS Digital Studios is about being on multiple platforms. So you saw on the end screen, youtube.com/PBS-Terra. If you go there, all of the content that's on that channel is about STEM, and we're really leaning into focusing on climate change because, as you said, it is the issue of our time, right? And the decisions we make now are mattering so much. So one of the things that I think we all tend to do as consumers, right, is search for stuff when we have a question. And YouTube is a search engine. It's the largest one in the world. And you'll probably find the answer to your question on YouTube, or maybe how to do something, and that's solutions, right? So we're there and we're really trying to serve as a way to inform younger audiences specifically in approachable, accessible ways with our content in ways that you can find just by searching, right? And of course subscribing, but one of the things that we do with our show Weather is taking the topic of weather, which who doesn't talk about it, right? And then being able to explore, yes, the science, but also the human piece of it, and talking to the people who are on the ground experiencing these extreme weather events, breaking down the science, MyMA, science communicators, also meteorologists, and able to kind of take this, grand issue and idea, distill it down to that flood, that earthquake, and then also, because we're living in it now, climate change is now, it's been happening, giving folks, hey, this is what you can do to prepare. So it really is focused on, the weather, and let's talk about the weather, but taking it a step further from there and hearing from the people who are experiencing it firsthand, and then putting on the information they need. And we do that on YouTube, but we're also on TikTok and on Instagram, and it's increasingly important because if you are on those platforms, you're searching for things too, right? And everything you watch on those platforms, your For You page, right? The more you see. So that's why we're increasingly bringing that kind of material to these spaces, because there's also a lot of information out there that's misinformation and disinformation, and the more that shows like this and this kind of content can be on platforms like TikTok and Instagram, we're in essence fighting that misinformation, right? Our editorial standards are second to none at PBS, and that's why we have, the American people's trust year over year. And I think it's really, really important for us to be increasingly in these spaces with this kind of content.
Thanks, Maribel. That idea of being on the ground with the people who are experiencing these things directly, really informs what you're doing today. It really informs what you've been doing. Can you talk a little bit about ways that you think about that? Beyond just simple buzzwords and representation, who is really living this, and who's telling the story, and how is that different depending on who you're doing areas and you're talking about? Both of you, I think.
I think one really great example would be in our main episode, Your Home State. That, as soon as we started doing our pre-production research into what kinds of outdoor stories, because we did Maine in February, we were very specifically looking for a winter story. On purpose, right. And people don't just hole up in your house. You go outside and experience nature and the outdoors in the middle of February. And we all prepared by buying a lot of gear that we didn't need because it was quite warm, which was the thing. So, but when we were choosing stories for Maine, I think, the first thing you always think about is lobster, right? Like, oh, that's a huge industry that created that state in so many ways. But a lot of people have heard the lobster story. And actually, the lobster story is that it's changing drastically there. The lobster's moving. It's moving north. It's moving into deeper ocean because the water is too warm for them. But our way into that story, instead of simply going to the same sort of lobster stories that a lot of people have told in the past, and seeing it from this very sort of depressing and upsetting way, we told the story of a company that had shifted to oyster farming because they discovered that they could control their crop essentially through that kind of farming, as opposed to just having to go out into the open ocean and having so much impact, the weather and the warming water, on their livelihood. So they had figured out this way to work with what they were given. So these people, generations of lobster people, who know firsthand that it's undeniable what is happening in that water. It threatens the entire identity of that state in so many ways. And they're thinking about the next generations, like now this breakdown of multiple generations who are lobstering. Now they're shifting to these types of farming and oystering and kelp farming and mussels and things like that. There was actually an incredible amount of optimism about the fact that they were able to make that shift. And thank God people like oysters too. And so there's a lot going on. There's still a sadness about what is changing about their way of life, but always looking forward and coming up with, this just has to be your practical solution.
Urgency and agency and opportunity. Now, Shane, you weren't just the presenter and host, but you were really intimately involved in the stories that you chose to tell, and you brought some of your full self to that. What kind of impact did you feel from it? Because his show is really successful. We're going to do more of it. It's great. And part of it was because of, we heard this from folks I'd never seen a show like that before. Like, how did that help, and how did that make it so successful?
So I think there's sort of two levels to that. Like one, I grew up on PBS. PBS was one of the very first places where I saw people like me telling stories, right? And there is, an importance to being able to make that connection to what you're seeing on the screen, but also by introducing an audience to people and their stories. They get bits of information that maybe they don't even understand that they're getting at the time, because they're listening to someone, they're having something experiential happening, but at the same time, they're getting a history, they're getting a culture lesson, and a better understanding of how our changing environment is affecting people in different places in very, very different ways. And I think, especially as you get to younger demographics, it becomes harder and harder, because you have this idea of shifting baselines. When you think of what a forest is, or what the plains are, or what climate is, if you've only been around 10, 12 years, that is what is normal, right? But to be able to, sit down and talk with someone, it was an interesting experience for me, because as a biologist who studies the impacts of how humans drive the process of evolution in other species, I went into a lot of these episodes like, oh yeah, I'm an expert on this thing. And then you begin to talk with people who are so intimately connected with the subject matter from a completely different way. By the end of the episode, it's like, I didn't really know all that much about this actually. And to have someone be able to follow me on that journey, of learning and experiencing different cultures and different places. And not all of it is, crime and doom and gloom. A lot of it is like going out and having fun with someone and offering an honest piece of yourself and giving them a chance to offer an honest piece of themselves, and everything else comes out in the watch. But for those that are watching, they get an understanding of how these things that they think are disconnected are actually intimately connected in all these weird, strange, phenomenal ways.
Thanks very much, Dr. Mann. What we've heard from Shane, what we've heard from Faye, if you've seen any of these shows, there are conversations had with people who you wouldn't necessarily think care about climate change, but they do in a different way. When you get into conversations, and people go home for Thanksgiving, and you get your uncle or your aunt in there, how do you break through preconceived notions on all sides? So we won't get into details, but one of the things we ran into through the book writer, did not want us to call horses feral. And that was the biggest thing we got, which is not what you expect, right? You expect a different side. Barrington, they had a great conversation with the mayor of Tangier Island, and he's as red-hatted as you can get, but he's really worried about rising sea levels. How do we do this collectively, all of us who care about this? Have conversations that don't get into panels or ideological arguments. Just talk.
Yeah, it's a great question, because the issues like climate have become so polarized, and we live in a hyper-partisan world today, where there's sort of, there's almost a tribal identification of climate denial in some parts of our political spectrum. It's part of your identity is to deny that climate change exists or is a problem. And so sometimes we find, as my good friend Susan Joy Hassel likes to say, that the front door is closed. You're not going to barge through with facts and figures and graphs. You're not listening. So you look for a side door. And there are lots of side doors. Humor is a side door. Satire is a side door. I think that's why some of our most difficult truths emerge in on-comedy shows, on late-night comedy. Some of the hardest-hitting commentary is there, or on the cartoons and the editorial pages of our newspapers. So humor and satire, and storytelling. Once again, when you make it personal. Shane, you were earlier, you made a really important point. It's easy to dismiss beliefs or premises or ideas. It's much more difficult to dismiss people face to face. And so we look for those stories, and we all have them. I mean, I'm a climate scientist for decades now. I hate to say it, for literally decades that I've been researching climate change. But it didn't strike, it didn't really hit home for me until a number of years ago. Some of you may remember, I think it was 2017, maybe it was 2018, July, It was so hot in Phoenix that airplanes couldn't take off. I don't know if you remember that. There were widespread reports about it. That night, I was holed up at an airport in Phoenix, Arizona with my family. We'd just come back from the Grand Canyon. We were going to fly out the next day. And I went swimming in the pool at this hotel, this outdoor pool, which was like a hot tub. The water was unbearably hot. You burned your feet walking on the pavement afterwards. We readily retreated to our air-conditioned room. That night at about 3 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened. Our daughter couldn't breathe. And it turns out that she had what's called, I guess, a conditional asthma. Most of the time she doesn't have asthma, but when it's as hot as it was in Phoenix, and there is high levels of surface ozone as there were, she's suddenly very sensitive to those air quality issues. And she couldn't breathe. We had to take her to the emergency room in the middle of the night. And unfortunately, they put her on an inhaler, and we understood that she has this sensitivity, and we're now aware of it. But for me, that's when climate change hit home. I had been impacted personally in the most intimate way by the effects of climate change. And I think we all have those stories now. Every single one of us knows somebody with a story like that, or we've experienced a story like that. And when we share them with people, then it becomes part of our sort of, it becomes part of just our way of interacting with each other, is to share these stories that raise awareness and depoliticize it. Because it's about us. It's not about politics. It's about us and the things that we value and the people we care about.
I was going to say, I think that point, like that is where the importance of diversity comes in, I think, with regard to storytelling. Because the thing is, literally everyone has a story. Yeah, it doesn't matter where you're from, what your political leanings are. You know, in shooting Human Footprint, you know, we went to a lot of different places, and some of the most amazing conversations I had about both nature and like the changing environment. Like we went to the middle of Illinois for a redneck fishing competition. You know, there are Confederate flags all over the place. I'm quite uncomfortable in a lot of ways. You know, but then out on the boat, you know, getting smacked in the face by these fish that are jumping out of the water. Like, I had this amazing conversation, you know, with this third, fourth generation fishermen. You know, it's like self-proclaimed redneck, you know, hooting and hollering and doing, you know, something very culturally different than I'm used to. But at the same time, we're able to sit and connect on this one really important issue. And I think that is where, like, being able to show those stories, you know, and I think when we're watching in the media, we're so used to there being good guys and bad guys, right? And we really expect that. That's the one thing that journalists who were like interviewing me before the show started, the thing that just kept coming back, I kept expecting for like the next thing to be like, this is whose fault it is, right? And that's never the case. We're just not that simple, right? As a species, these issues are not that simple, and showing the universality of these issues, I think, is a really important part of that. But you can only do that if you step out of your comfort zone across so many like socioeconomic and political axes.
Thanks for that, and thank you for sharing that story. And it's a nice pivot to what we're going to talk about next, which I'm going to go a little long because I'm asking which is about kind of the local stories and just getting really that personal thing. And what I want to ask you about quickly, the way that it segues into it, is the platforms that there are. You know, I make these big shows with drone shots and all over the world and so forth, but you know, it takes years to do it. The internet allows you to build these communities, and like what you're doing with some of your shows, weather and TikTok stuff that you can do. Can you just quickly speak about the power of these new tools that other audiences and different things?
Yeah, one of the reasons I started in that space, I used to work on like the longer form documentary content, and one of the things that's beautiful about being in the digital space, and I think especially on a platform like YouTube, where if you subscribe to a YouTube channel and you're a big fan, you leave comments, you like, you respond to what's being said, and if the producer and the host is really engaged, they're going to respond back to you, right? So one of the ways that we use our audience to inform the types of programs that we're going to create. We can simply ask them. They're so engaged, and they say, why don't you do an episode about this topic, or this happened to me and I'd love to learn more about this or that. Once we start to see themes, we're like, we need to do an episode about that topic. They're telling us what to produce, and there's nothing more powerful than that, right? Because we want to be able to, help tell their stories. We might not be able to speak directly to that person, but we can speak to the masses and we can really listen to them and let it inform our content. And I think that's true across a lot of these different platforms, that immediate return of the audience response and being able to engage with them and being able to poll them, put out a poll on, how they're feeling about something or what they'd like to see, I think is really, really quite powerful and really is just, we have it at our fingertips, right? So the more we can do that, the better we can serve and reach our audiences, and hopefully reach more newer and younger audiences as well.
Thanks, Maribel. And it is a nice segue to the next panel we're going to have that really, really gets local. We're going to do a quick transition with some video, and then we'll be joined by Susan Phillips, who is the senior reporter and editor for WHYY's Climate Desk. So we'll begin Darcy.
Go on a sonic adventure into unexpected corners of the health and science world each Monday at noon on 90.9 WHYY FM with host Mike and Scott. Designed for those who have an insatiable curiosity and thirst for knowledge, The Pulse shares the latest cutting-edge breakthroughs and information, and in ways we can all understand.
This technology has completely revolutionized our lives.
The Pulse with host Mike and Scott. Listen live every Monday at noon on 90.9 WHYY FM.
Great topics that we're talking about. I love, by the way, I just love some of PBS's new shows on nature. Nature is the stalwart show, but I love those new shows. They're just amazing. So I just want to give a plug for that. You guys should check them out. But I'm here. I just wanted to reintroduce some folks, or there's some new folks on the panel. Bethany Wiggins. She's just an amazing local resource that everyone should know about. But her actual title is Director of Penn Program in Environmental Humanities. And of course, everyone knows Michael Mann. He's now the Presidential Distinguished Professor and Director of Penn Center for Science and Sustainability. And next to him is my boss, Sarah Glover. She is the Vice President of WHYY News and Civic Dialogue. And of course, we all know Gardner, because he's done some amazing programming work getting climate coverage and climate programming on PBS, and so he's been leading that. So we've got some great folks here. But the first question I want, actually, I'm going to start with Bethany, because Bethany's done some amazing work doing climate storytelling in really unconventional ways. And one thing I was really involved in was with high school students that Bethany has worked with telling their own climate stories. And the question I have for you is sort of, what did you learn from that? And I'm just wondering if there's like one story about a student you can tell us about that, you saw the transition, or you saw the transformation of your education program.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, and thanks for being here. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I'm going to actually point out one of those students in just a minute, so ask her if you're ready. But the program that I started that you mentioned, it's called My Climate Story, and it really draws on that insight that, Mike, that you shared, that we all actually understand really that global climate change is happening, but it's not until we really feel it in our own lives and in our own bodies that it becomes meaningful and actionable, that we actually want to do something about it. And so in a very sort of moment of despair, I thought, like, what can I do? And I thought, well, I'm a literature professor, and I'm also an environmentalist, and I understand something about story and narrative, and I also am a teacher. So working with my students here at Penn, over the last 4 years, we've grown this curriculum that helps people to identify what is their climate story. And then it shares those stories in a public data bank, or what we call a story bank, that's searchable via climate impact and location. It's a resource for teachers, really, to be able to pull those really personal stories of climate change to really make it meaningful for students in their classrooms. This last year, I was really privileged to be able to work with Philadelphia school district teachers who piloted that curriculum, and then we also had a special group of high school students in that. 300 students who were working with them. We also had 13 who are climate heroes, and Aster Chow is sitting there. She's a student from the Academy of Colombo. Aster will tell her own story at an event here at Penn next week, so you can come back for that. She's really amazing. I don't know, Aster, if you want to say, like, stand up and just shout out, like, what it is to be a climate hero. We'll come back to you. I don't want to put you on the spot.
I mean, and again, I mean, I had a very brief workshop. Aster was there, and along with a lot of her fellow students, and I was really amazed at how, you know, the insight that these kids had into their changing climate, right? They've not even been on this planet for 2 decades, and yet they had really amazing stories to tell, mostly about the end of snow days. Right, which is, with that came like sort of climate grief and lots of things. But I think what happens and what your program does is work to empower these kids to then take action. And I wanted to ask you, Dr. Mann, I know there's a whole focus on climate solutions journalism and not, as you said, be doom and gloom, because that kind of wears us all out. How do we do that? And I'm asking you this because you're very much about accountability. How do we do that and also hold the powerful accountable?
Thanks. It's a great question, and I didn't really realize I had a good answer to that question until this moment. Just listening to Bethany and the stories that these young folks are telling, it's making a difference when it comes to making progress in dealing with the climate crisis. And the example that I'm going to use is a group called Our Children's Trust. It's an organization that is bringing lawsuits at the state level and the national level to basically force policymakers to act on the climate crisis, because it does fundamentally threaten. Our youth have standing, legal standing, because their future is threatened. And despite the fact that the fossil fuel industry, so there was a case, the Montana case.
Yeah, they just did
a huge win. I mean, at a time when we reached an impasse in the legislative branch, the executive branch is running up into issues with the Supreme Court. Some of the executive actions that this administration has tried to take to, for example, limit new fossil fuel infrastructure is being challenged right now in the courts. And so there's sort of this impasse in the executive branch and the legislative branch, but we're seeing some remarkable successes in the judicial branch of our government. And that's because that's where young people are taking the fight to I won't say the enemy, but to some vested interests. And despite the overwhelming money and just sort of legal firepower that the fossil fuel industry has at its disposal, the young folks won that court case. And Montana now has to take concerted action to deal with climate change. And what won the case were the powerful stories that each of those young folks who were, they were expert, they were witnesses in this case. And they were each able to tell in a very powerful way how their lives have been detrimentally impacted by the climate crisis. And it was so compelling that all of the fossil fuel money in all the world wasn't able to compete with the moral authority of those children as they testified. It was a major win, and it turns out it's a precedent now. Other states can take similar action. There were some very clever lawyers working for our Children's Trust who recognized that the Montana Constitution actually contains some provisions that require the government to not impact the environment, the air and the water and the environment of their people. And it turns out many of the state constitutions have similar language. And so that now creates a precedent we're going to see a whole lot more action along these lines in the future.
Yeah, and it just goes to show that, there's so many different ways to make change. And in the courtroom, good stories make change, just like everywhere else. But I wanted to pass the mic to Sarah. And one of the things that Sarah's been really great about, and she's been here, I don't know, it's been a year? It's been a year, wow. One of the first things when she came to WHYY, she said, hey, we're going to make climate a priority. And so that's why we have the new climate desk. That's why we have different people doing climate stories from all over different beats, arts reporters doing climate stories that are really kind of interesting and not doom and gloom at all. There was the zero waste story that Peter Crimmins did where some local filmmakers actually did a film and all the waste that this film created ended up in a mason jar. And Peter just did such a great job with that one. But Sarah, if you just talk to me about, why you think local climate journalism is so important.
Thank you for the question. It's so great to be here. I just wanted to start off by saying, what an exciting time it is to be a journalist. I mean, if you're young people out there listening, thinking of a career to enter into, I'd encourage you to consider, because we have a lot of capability to tell stories, to elevate communities, but really I think where we're heading here, what we're talking about is we can contribute to solving problems, right? We're actually contributing to solving societal ills. And what's so important about journalism, which I like to call the big J, is that, and what we do at WHYY News is put strong emphasis on fair and balanced reporting. So we don't lean into a story with an agenda or a side. We really take great pains to tell the story, which is actually the whole story. And furthermore, we work, nonstop around the clock to center communities and to center people and people stories. And I think that's why, in this effort to really center the climate work, why we're so effective is because we're really searching not just to uncover the issues and unpack the issues, but to surface solutions and focus on people. Focus on the people in the region. It was great to partner with Bethany's project on the Climate Storytelling Fest with students across the Philadelphia city high schools. We had over 200 students, and to partner with Penn on that project was really powerful. And I think that's what we do well, and quite frankly, we have a responsibility as not only the fourth estate, not only being in the journalism industry, but working in nonprofit and public media to really take advantage of the fact that we can bring communities and people together to have engaging and meaningful conversations, and that we have the expertise on our staff. Uniquely at WHYY News, we have about a dozen people who focus on science, climate, and environment, and that is very special. Most newsrooms in America don't have that number of reporters dedicated, and it really speaks to the dedication of our newsroom. And for me, as Susan mentioned, coming into the news org last summer, you look around the room and you see the themes and you see the strengths, and Susan being one of them, how important it is for us to communicate effectively externally what we're up to at WHYY, and to establish a climate desk really centers all of that expertise. It helps us to connect with communities here at Penn and other folks around the region who are doing this work. And also, we think Philadelphia, where something happens in Philadelphia, there goes the country. We feel that this is a very important place within the broader ecosystem of what's happening with climate across the nation. And so we definitely want to be a part of those conversations. But again, most importantly, it's centering people. It's centering communities. And we're very, very much dedicated to making sure that we're serving our local audience and seeking feedback and having in-real-life events that are going to enrich and educate and help support others to find solutions and elevate and tell the stories of the people in the communities who are already working towards solutions. So that's where, when we think about representation and the types of stories we tell, it certainly doesn't need to be all doom and gloom. We should be inspiring, educating, and you can count on WHYY News for that. And local news is such, we're in a crisis. Let's just put it out there across the country where local news outlets are receding in terms of the volume of staff and the number of publications from newsrooms and even broadcast organizations. And so not only do we look for and need the support to keep going, but we're just definitely committed to filling the gap that
and there's
we won't
a huge
get
gap.
other news sources.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's great that, there was a huge gap in climate reporting before, locally and regionally, before we started our desk. But, we have Sarah to thank for that, for sure. But I also wanted to ask you, Bill, at PBS, what is PBS's role in terms of local journalism and connecting with the local community? Because everyone thinks of PBS as sort of national and these great national shows like Nature, Frontline. I mean, what is the role and why is it important to have these connections locally?
We're a system, right? And it's almost like Russian nesting dolls in a way. Like we are top down and bottom up, and the power that we have is from the local stations who are doing these in the communities. Now, at the national level, like we see the content we do when we say solutions oriented, it's also not naive. Like we're trying to, we're not painting the world as if everybody just does this, everything will be great. We're trying to be really realistic. And as we program our content, I'm very conscious of anything that we do. The shows we heard about earlier, they're very geographically diverse. So if we're doing a story about water in the Great Lakes, we're trying to find ways to make sure we talk about the Mississippi and the way it goes down, because we're very cognizant that the local stations can pick it up and run with it or complement it. We want to hear from work that some of our team are doing. If it comes up that we can talk about something that's happening in Philly. We do stories about community agriculture that's going on here. So that, what's it called? Philly Fishes is an organization that is fiction to people. I completely slipped my mind, but it falls into Hope in the Water series that's coming next summer. We look for ways that then as we go out to the stations that are out there in their communities, can take it and run with it. And the other thing too is for us, we do not do any advocacy, we cannot, because of who we are as the national public group, but the local stations can be a little edgier if they want to because they're on the ground. And I don't think anybody does it in a partisan way, but we just try to state the facts. We partner with organizations, NGOs at the global level, local communities. What we're doing here is get these conversations out there with the content that we're bringing. And it really is a village to do it all. And there is no, in our mind, a national and a local separation. We're just kind of doing slightly different things using slightly different tools to reach the same goals, and we count on all of those stations.
So, any of your shows coming to Philly soon, or focusing on Philly, or the Delaware River Valley?
And this Hope in the Water series, the Diana Ross story here is looking after. We have a big focus on that's coming next summer. Where we're actually doing, this is a perfect example of your question. We're trying to think about these themes. So next summer we're really concentrating on ocean health. So we have a special on coral and coral bleaching that we're doing with the BBC. They're very large global storytelling. And we're going to do this project called Hope in the Water that's about aquaculture and opportunities to feed people diving into the oceans. And farmed fish isn't necessarily as nasty as people have been made out to be. That leads into another project we're doing about the coast of Maine called Sea Change and how that's changing all the way up. So we have this critical mass that just passes on, and what we really look at is how we can engage in communities. So there might be a sequence in Hope in the Water that's about Philly. There's going to be another one coming up that's going to be about Hudson. There's going to be something up for forgetting New Jersey, but whatever. So there'll be something about that. And so we can kind of move up the coast, and the engagement activities, they hand off to each other. And our stations, as much as we can, we have these great sessions at our annual meeting called Steal This Idea. And we're just trying to share things that can kind of go around and spread that wealth. And what you said, Sarah, that was so important, what the difference between a nonprofit organization is and a commercial organization is. Who the constituents are. We see our shareholders are communities. We're not trying to sell products. We're trying to sell just coming together. It's a completely different business model, and it leads into the type of information that we're putting out there. When you talk about misinformation, disinformation, people are doing that for a reason. They're trying to make people think a certain thing, to do a certain type of behavior that's usually in the commercial space. It's always trying to make money, getting somebody to do something different. You're a nonprofit, that's not what motivates you. So you can just completely think about this in a way. I'll stop in a second. Just to quote our CEO, Paula Kerber, who likes to say, we're in a similar business than some of our competitors in the broadcasting world, but we're using very different tools. And the outcomes are therefore different.
Absolutely. And I mean, you talked about misinformation, and I just wanted to ask Dr. Mann, if you could talk about, like, you know, that was really interesting actually when you talked about what hit you personally in Phoenix, and I'm just wondering, how has it hit you here in the Philadelphia region? And yeah, I'm just curious about that, and what kind of local local climate stories that you see on the horizon that we should be focusing on.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, how hasn't it hit us here in Philly in recent years? I mean, I arrived not too long after Ida, and just the massive flooding and the displacement, and there are all sorts of issues of climate justice, environmental justice that come in here because those who are the least well-off frontline communities or in the regions that see the worst flooding. I'm on the 27th floor of the Marano building, so I'll be just fine up there when the next flood comes, but there are a lot of people down in the trenches, people who've lost homes. And so, so there are events that have taken place here that drive home all of these other dimensions of the climate crisis, the social justice and environmental justice dimensions of the climate crisis. Philadelphia had the worst air quality in the world for several days this summer, as many of you are probably aware. When has that ever happened before?
Did you ever see that purple in the bad air? It was always orange, and then suddenly it's purple, and then magenta.
So like a Prince-like purple haze.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the New York skyline, and that's gotten a lot of attention. A lot of people have been talking about New York City and what they saw this summer, but we saw it here in Philly as well. And sometimes the air quality, those particulates, whether or not we had sort of the same remarkable sort of orange pall that New York had, we still saw the very dangerous air quality issues. And there were the folks who lost their lives in the flash floods in Bucks County, not far from here. And this is climate change playing out in real time. Just a short science lesson for y'all. A warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, so when you get rainfall, you get more of it in short bursts, and that's what we're seeing in terms of these extremely damaging and deadly flooding events, and we've seen it here just this summer in Pennsylvania. But in many regions of the United States and elsewhere, we saw this in Canada, we saw this in Maui. Hotter soil dries out more. You get that record heat like we've seen in recent years. You combine that with drought. It's not rocket science. You get larger, faster spreading, more extensive, more damaging, more deadly wildfires. And so we're seeing climate change has sort of shown its full hand this summer, and we've seen it here in Philadelphia.
Absolutely.
I just want to add one thing to show that shows narrative. Evolution of Earth is kind of a really beautiful high-end natural history show that shows this. There is this commentary that climate has changed on Earth for a long time, and all this stuff. That's true, but there are repercussions to that. And some of the animals are adapting, some of them are not. And I think to your point, we're just telling the story as it is, and you can see right in front of you the actual consequences of what's happening. We can tell those stories in a non-competition. It's
right, the story of personal stories. And I think, the other thing that's been happening here in Philadelphia, like when I started covering climate, it was always, okay, it's going to get hotter and wetter, hotter and wetter, and hotter and wetter. And we, like you said, we see that, but even the first week of school, we did stories, our education reporter teamed up with another climate reporter,
and we did the stories about how these kids and these parents are facing going to school in unair-conditioned buildings that were built in the 1930s, and no one would have thought that in September it would be 98 degrees. So things are really changing, and so WHYY and the Climate Desk can bring those voices and, like you said, just put it out there and kind of foster empathy and understanding. And I think we don't have much more time left, but we've been itching.
I just wanted to piggyback on what you were saying, that I think that one of the really most alarming climate stories here in Philadelphia is the fact that so many of our buildings, including especially our schools, are not climate ready. That is certainly true for the Philadelphia School District. And the students who we've been working with are, of course, aware of that. But one of the amazing things about the project is that they have made this incredible documentary that is about their school, in this case Paul Robeson High School, about 2 blocks from here, that is just super hot. There's no trees, there's no green roof, there is nothing there, and these students are incredibly astute. Their teachers are incredibly generous, and the conditions that they are working in do not match the conditions of excellence that they are fostering. So they told that story, and it's just an incredible film, and I think that the more that we can elevate and amplify these voices, I think the more solutions we can have.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And okay, I guess it's time to wrap up. I want to thank everybody, thank all the panelists, and I guess we're going to Q&A, is that what it is? Okay, great. Do we have a question? What? Okay. Oh, right here and right here. Do folks have any questions? Questions, comments, ideas for stories, story pitches, all of them.
You ask a question of Dr. Mann, you get extra credit.
And if you just tell us your name and where you're from first, that'd be great. Okay, I don't know if that mic is on.
Fran Gibson. I live in Havertown, which is outside of the city, but I'm in the quintessential Philadelphia. I went to school here, college, graduate school. I was born here at Penn, and I'm about 10 miles away living right now. So, but my husband's from Los Angeles, and my question is this. He has spent all of his life protecting water because there's not. He's been in rafts and trips. And at one point, about 15 to 20 years ago, he said, we're going to have to invest in cisterns. And my question to you is, what are we going to do about making that a prominent problem vocally so that we could all work on it? Because we found out we couldn't afford to start a whole industry in cisterns, but we can do things. And I haven't seen anything about saving water or protecting water or purifying water other than what I've read. You know, California has a real problem. And so I thought maybe you could create something.
Okay,
I can take a stab at that locally, Fran, which is really not so much about cisterns. As you've heard, Philadelphia has maybe too much water. And one of the, but what cisterns do, of course, is to hold water. Another thing that holds water are rain gardens and green roofs. And the Philadelphia Water Department has actually been doing a wonderful job and has a lot of free resources, including street tree planting and green roofs and rain garden resources. So that's not cisterns, but it's definitely about improving water quality and keeping water in place so it doesn't run off so quickly.
Right. And it has to be a big picture idea. I have my own rain garden, and I grow everything in my garden to eat for the whole year.
Are you, just a quick question, are you concerned about water quality or water quantity in this region? Quantity in this
Southwest,
region.
I have family in the Southwest and in California, and I think drought is a big problem.
Yeah.
So I was hoping to see more of it.
Yeah. I know in this region, like Bethany said, we had lots of water and we're going to get more, and the problem's going to be flooding, and flooding has its own issues with water. But I don't know if anyone here can answer a question about the Southwest.
I can just talk a bit about, we did episodes in various parts of the country, and water was actually a thing that came up repeatedly, not in this, but we did actually an entire episode about the Swanee River. And in telling a lot of those stories, one of the big things we talked a lot about was the watershed and how much a river is much more than just a river, right? It is everything all around that entire region. The river runs through so many communities, and people who don't even live particularly close to the river are vastly, incredibly affected by the quality and quantity of water. We also did a story in the Great Salt Lake. It's drying up. It might be gone in 5 years if people don't change their water consumption in that area. And being able to tell that story, because of course there's just the facts of it. We as scientists, we talked about the fact that this is what's going to happen if we don't change the way we use our water. The real practical effects of that, right? Like the air quality is going to be incredibly dangerous in Salt Lake City. When that water dries up, the lake bed is exposed. So I think we have so many of those types of stories just kind of sprinkled in all the different, because there is a water story everywhere. I mean, we also did New Mexico, where they had a catastrophic fire last summer, and we talked about recovering from that fire, because it's not going to change. Right? The drought is not going to change. They have to think about actually changing your own behavior on a macro level and on a micro level, because the reality is the reality.
And the reality is this: we have fear of not having enough food, enough museum period, all of those things. We have people in our lives today who are afraid of not having enough food.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Diego Granero. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in behavioral science here at Penn. I'm from New Jersey, and I just started at Penn last week, so I'm very new. But my question was that I feel like a lot of the stories that get told are people's personal stories. We heard a number today about their struggles with the changing climate. And I was trying to reconcile how we tell stories that are solution-driven. Because I think a lot of the stories are, the summer air quality and the water problems and not being able to, breathe because of air particulates. And so it's a lot of painful struggles that people are experiencing. And so to me, those are really powerful and important personal stories. And so I'm trying to think about how we can link those powerful personal stories with the solutions. Is it that we should just be highlighting new technologies and we should advocate for that in policy? Are the conversations that we're having in these stories with each other, or are they with lawmakers, or are they with scientists? I'm curious about that crossover between kind of the struggle and painful of these personal stories with the emphasis and importance of finding solutions to it. It's a great question.
Yeah, I've got some thoughts. Again, I would talk about the Montana case, because I think it brings those two things together. These kids were describing in great detail the horrible impacts that climate change had and is having on their lives, and yet by doing so, they were actually forcing the hand of our judicial system and did affect change in a very profound way. So maybe it's a somewhat unique example, but it is one that really does bridge those two things: the impacts, the urgency, with the agency, with young folks actually being the change that they wish to see in the world.
One of the things that we think about a lot as we develop stories are, you can't be too earnest at the same time, because it just goes hand-in-hand. When I was a kid, who were the big explorers and adventurers of Indiana Jones just came out? The explorers, that's so exciting. And now I think more and more, I try to focus on it, because people are shedding. Like the new explorers, the new, the new people that are really inspiring and exploring the world in like the new moon race to get to outer space. Like there are people who are coming up with solutions that are exciting, and then it can't be focused all the time. It can't be too earnest. It can't be too Pollyanna and feel good. It's got to be exciting. It's got to be energizing. When we first started talking about human footprint, I had a different title, and then it just became a conversation about the human footprint that's not necessarily negative. I mean, yes, we're of the planet, we're of the world, and we're doing things that are screwing up, but we're also doing things that are positive too. So let's focus on that excitement and motivate the audience to do things like the Life Panel. It's really empowering. Well, if you figure out roulette, it's just a small story, but it gets you excited and want to participate. And we focus on that.
Sorry, just to follow up, so I think when we're talking about solutions, I think it can be intimidating and kind of overwhelming. It's like, what is the solution to climate change? Well, I mean, that's a really hard question, right, to get at, but there are like solutions that come through like technology, technological innovation, scientific innovation, certainly like these big, sort of big changes that come from major innovations, but also solutions come from people like planting native gardens, right, in their backyard. Throughout filming human footprint and narrating Evolution Earth, there's all sorts of solutions that come about. So I mentioned the like redneck fishing competition. The whole purpose of that competition is to remove invasive Asian carp from the Illinois River, which accounts for, I mean, they completely overtaken that habitat, and this local community that has this long fishing history have they've taken back to fishing in order to try to make some kind of impact. So not everything has to be a grand, like, world-changing idea. The solutions, I think, in a lot of ways to the climate crisis is going to come from like major jumps from, that are the accumulation of tiny little steps. Things like a person plants a native garden, and then their neighbors plant a native garden, and then that goes to local government, and it becomes something that's citywide or countywide, et cetera, et cetera. So but even those small things, those seemingly small things, they stack up, and they help to sort of bend that trajectory, in the right direction.
If I could also add, like, from a newsroom perspective, we have to work much smarter. We have to be more nimble and be able to respond to these things happening in real time. So as an example, with the story with the air conditioning units lacking in 74 schools, we reported it that day as a daily story, but in fact, after we published the story, I went back to the reporter and said, okay, now we need to do a data version of the story. There's 120,000 kids in the Philadelphia school district. How many students are in those 74 schools? Let's quantify that. Let's look at the ratio of children. Let's look at that one neighborhood and zip code. Let's survey all the zip codes impacted. And then last, let's survey businesses in those areas to see, is there anyone who wants to step up and help this local school solve this problem? And then what would that look like as a cost to do business if you duplicated that by 74? So that's what newsrooms, I think, that's what we're doing at WHYY News. We're trying to help you see the solution by just asking the questions. So we're not saying to the businesses, you need to do this. We're saying, what if it looked like this? What could the result be? And so a news organization can't be passive. We can't sit back and just report the dateline for today. We actually have to be a part of that conversation and trigger those conversations around solutions. And that's an applied example, which you can only do it. I'll follow up with the reporter tonight and see when that story will be publishing. But again, that's a resource issue that the news organization has to commit to giving that reporter time to do the resources. We've got to get data assimilated and all of those things and aggregated. So it's a rough road, but we're on that track, and we see the importance for this work. And hopefully more people will follow that path. But in the meantime, between time, follow us and keep up with what we're doing and hold us to account, reach out and ask us questions, and we'll go get the answers.
Yeah, I will say just really quick, as a working journalist, your question goes to the heart of what we do every day. It's really hard. We have to balance breaking news with okay, next question.
Hi, my name is Maya. I'm originally from Los Angeles, but now I'm an undergrad at Penn. I'm actually one of Professor Nett's classes. I guess So a couple of years ago, I was watching a documentary. It was a David Attenborough documentary, A Life on Our Planet, and he said this quote that's like still stuck with me years later. We often talk of saving the planet, but the truth is that we must do these things to save ourselves. With or without us, the wild will return. I guess I was wondering how that kind of mindset influences how you communicate the climate crisis to other people.
David Attenborough, I think he's reached this point in his career where, like, basically, man, he's like, I've been telling y'all for the better part of the century, and you don't want to listen. And he's become a lot more straightforward about it. But, from a biological perspective, I think he's exactly right. A lot of people ask me, as someone who studies, like, human-driven evolution, it's like, will Earth, will the living world survive us? And in general, the answer is almost certainly yes. Like, we've had an incredible impact on this planet. The only thing in the entire history of Earth that has had as much impact as humans have been like the 5 major mass extinction events in Earth's past. And so we are having an incredible impact on the planet, and we are in the middle of a massive extinction crisis as well. But life, generally speaking, it is resilient enough where life as a whole is certainly going to survive us. The thing is, like, are we going to survive us? We are a lot more sensitive in so many ways to the changes that we're making because we've reached a point where we need so much. And because we need so much, we're stripping so much. And in that stripping, we then, we handicap ourselves. So the question isn't sort of whether or not life is going to survive us, but what life is going to look like on the other side, with us or without us. And I think that is the big question, and I think a big part of both human footprint and evolution Earth is to think critically, because this isn't, these aren't issues that you can buy out of, right? Either that you can choose to make a decision or not make a decision, but even in not making a decision, you made a decision that has cascading consequences, that has impacts on the natural world. And I think the critical question in the conversation is, what do we want our world to look like in a decade, in 50 years, in 100 years, in 1,000 years? Because the reality is, the future of life on this planet, with our lives and life generally, like across the tree of life, is going to be what we decide to make it. And we need to figure out exactly what we want that to be.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Brendan Chapko. I am an undergraduate and a survivor of Professor Mann's 8:30 lecture last semester. Two of the first things that you all brought up right at the beginning were, one, PBS doesn't deal in doom and gloom, and then Professor Mann, you brought up we need to cut carbon emissions in half by the end of the decade. And there seems to be this conundrum between positivity and severity, and I was just wondering how you found ways to balance that. Is there a target ratio in between, or does it depend on the story of the show?
Great question.
If I tell you the secret, you can take a job. So
I would appreciate that.
When we say doom and gloom, it's about the hopelessness of it. And I think being really clear-eyed is saying, like, if we do this, then this is the result of it. I don't see that necessarily as doom and gloom because it's about context. I think about some of these films that have been out there, and it's going to seem like I'm throwing stones, I don't mean to be, but some of like the really high-end or well-known environmental films of the last few years were about big bangs that kicked off the planet to this, but the are still out there. What was it? Did it just instill outrage in people? And I think that's where I try to come from. Not to criticize these films, but if you're just trying to create outrage in your audience, what does it get? So I think speaking clearly and honestly actually can be empowering. And just when Maya asked that question, I almost said something. We're working on a project now about different human-like species. There are human-like species who died out because of the pressures of their degradation of where they live and climate change. So that can be pretty existentially terrifying if you talk about it that way, but it's also, just science, and it's just the way that it is, and I think the way that Shane Show is, and things that he's talking about, it's about choices, and I think that what we really try to do with what you're doing, with what we're doing, informs those unexpected ways. Some of it's dark, but it's not just a dead end.
Oh, real quick. Yeah, I guess it's sort of both of the two stellar students from two different semesters in my class. Thanks so much to both of you for asking these questions. And I will try to give a response that sort of brings it together. And it's gratuitous of me because it references my forthcoming book, Fragile Moment. But the point of the book is that we are at this fragile moment. And it's not doom, but it's not, what we're dealing with is this duel between elements of the climate system, of the Earth system, that instill resilience, and elements that instill fragility. And we are at that intermediate point right now where if we take the actions necessary, we can prevent a disastrous future. But if we don't act, and we've got to act quickly and concertedly, then some of those worst case scenarios become on the table. So it comes back to us. It comes back to whether or not we're willing to take the actions to preserve this fragile moment. And we wouldn't all be out here talking about this and doing everything that we're doing if we didn't think it was still possible to do so.
Thank you all. And I think that's a wrap.